It is so nice to see everybody here, to see everybody's faces outside the world of the universe. Just before I introduce John, we have everyone automatically muted on entry, and we're not going to let you unmute yourselves until we get to the Q&A part, just because we want to make sure that that there aren't any accidental interruptions. But if there is a reason that you need to be unmuted during John's talk, just message me in the chat, and we can we can let you unmute yourself if there's a reason for that. So the way that today is going to work, John is going to give his talk, and then we are going to have a Q&A at the end, and there will be plenty of time for questions, and we will use the raise hand function to keep the Q&A organized, but also you are more than welcome to put questions and thoughts and ideas in the chat, and anybody is also welcome to respond to those questions, ideas, and thoughts in the chat. So there can be an ongoing conversation happening there also. John was very clear that he needs no introduction and doesn't want me to waste any of his time by introducing him, but he doesn't always get what he wants. So I'm going to do this my way. Uh, all of us know John Jordan. He is our wonderful and beloved founding director of the Dickens Project. He has been running this organization at the beginning along with Murray Baumgarten and now along with me for 45 years. And he is the heart and soul of what the project is and what we are. He is also the author of a book on Bleak House called Supposing Bleak House, and the co-editor with Bob Patten and Catherine Waters of the Oxford Handbook of Charles Dickens, which came out just a few years ago. And I think that a number of folks here have essays in that or have certainly read parts of that handbook. He is one of the foremost scholars we have on Charles Dickens, and just one of those people who wonderfully knows everything. Which is amazing and a gift to all of us. The reason that we are here today, as many of you remember, is that this was a talk that John was supposed to give at our Dickens Universe last summer, focused on the Old Curiosity Shop. Unfortunately, he caught COVID right at the beginning of that universe and wasn't able to give this talk. So we promised him that if he would just stay home and stay in bed and get well, we would find a moment to reschedule. So this is our moment to reschedule, and we are very, very excited to be able to hear this talk that we missed this summer. And I also promised that I would give a plug for the Dickens Universe for next summer, because it is one of the books of John's heart. We are going to be doing Bleak House next summer. The Dickens Universe is scheduled from July 25th to August 1st, and it's going to be a really, really wonderful week. So we hope to see as many of you there, either in person or virtually, as we possibly can. So I'm going to now turn things over to John, and we are going to hear about the old soundscape in the Old Curiosity Shop.
Thanks, Renee. And thank you, everyone, for taking part of your Sunday to listen to a talk about the Old Curiosity Shop. My talk, Renee has given the title, Dickens and Soundscape, the Old Curiosity Shop. The talk has two parts, and they correspond more or less to the two parts of my title. The first part is kind of an introduction, and it talks about soundscape, where that term comes from, about sound studies as an academic field of study, about some of the work that has been done on Dickens and sound, and about Dickens's ideas about sound. And it ends with a simple taxonomy of the different kinds of sounds that exist in Dickens novels generally, and in the Old Curiosity Shop in particular. So that's the first part. And the second part is a bunch of passages from the Old Curiosity Shop that I'll talk about individually. And so let's go to the next slide, Courtney. Thank you. With his important 1977 book, the tuning of the world. And you'll see that that's now the subtitle of uh, uh, the re-edition of this book. And the soundscape stands now as the title of the book. With his important 1977 book, The Tuning of the World, composer environmentalist R. Murray Schafer introduced the term soundscape into scholarly discourse, and together with his colleagues in the World Soundscape Project, inaugurated the discipline of acoustic ecology. Sound studies, as this interdisciplinary field has come to be known more generally, draws on a large number of more traditional research areas, including musicology, acoustics, the phenomenology of hearing, architecture, urban planning, theater studies, anthropology, and the history of sound recording technologies, to name only a few. The field has its own specialized journals. Next slide, Courtney. Soundscape, a journal of acoustic ecology founded in 2000 and named after Schafer's influential term. Sound Studies, founded in 2013, and the Journal of Sonic Studies, also begun in 2011. Yeah, I got the dates wrong. It has its own professional organizations, the World Forum for Acoustic Ecology, established in 1993, and the European Sound Studies Association, founded in 2012. And it's seen, next slide, it has seen the publication of a growing number of sound studies handbooks and anthologies designed for use in college and university courses. Next slide. Formed by an analogy with more familiar English words such as landscape and cityscape, the term soundscape eludes easy definition. For Schafer, a soundscape is any acoustic field of study. The term as thus defined has been criticized by some as too vague, and Schafer's use of it is too freighted with ideological assumptions. But it has caught on in part because of its very vagueness, which allows it to be adapted for many purposes. Soundscapes can be perceived, recorded, invented, reconstructed, or represented. They can be found in natural or made environments. They can be created by engineers and sound artists, and they can be analyzed by historians and cultural critics. Although sound studies research has largely tended to focus on periods since the invention of modern sound recording technologies, recent decades have witnessed a steady increase in the number of studies devoted to recovering and analyzing sounds of the more distant past. Important contributions here, in the next slide, please, include Alain Corbin's Les Cloches de la Terre, which was translated as village bells, sound, and meaning in the 19th century French countryside. Bruce Smith's The Acoustic World of Early Modern England, and Stephen Connor's Dumbstruck, A Cultural History of Ventriloquism. Within Victorian studies, John Picker's Victorian Soundscapes was the first sustained attempt to examine the place of sound in 19th century British literature and culture. Picker's chapter on Dickens is especially noteworthy for the information it contains about Dickens's interest in the rather eccentric theory of sound advanced by his friend, the mathematician Charles Babbage. In his ninth Bridgewater treatise, a fragment from 1837, Babbage proposed the idea, which he claimed to derive from Laplace, that the Earth's atmosphere functions like a huge recording device. According to Babbage, every sound ever made and every word ever spoken leaves an impression on the molecules of the air. These molecules and the pulsations they receive, he argues, retain, however faintly, the imprint of their source, and at least in principle and under certain circumstances can be made to reproduce the original sound. So the next slide, please. And this is the quote from Babbage. The air itself is one vast library on whose pages are forever written all that man has ever said or woman whispered. There, in their mutable but unerring characters, mixed with the earliest as well as with the latest sighs of mortality, stand forever recorded, vows unredeemed, promises unfilled, perpetuating in their united movements of each particle the testimony of man's changeful will. This remarkable quotation, Picker goes on to show, explains an otherwise obscure passage in Dombey and Son, where Dickens describes the socially volatile character of Sir Barnet Skettles as like a sound in air, the vibration of which, according to the speculation of an ingenious modern philosopher, may go on traveling forever through the interminable fields of space. The ingenious modern philosopher here is, of course, Babbage, and Dickens's paraphrase neatly summarizes the main tenet of his theory. Evidence of Dickens's interest in sound and its effects can be found at many points in his novels. Until recently, however, attention to the sonic dimensions of his fiction has centered primarily on questions of voice. Readers have long recognized Dickens's extraordinary ability to capture the distinctive accent and speech patterns of his characters. Jingle, Sam Weller, Mrs. Gamp, Micawber, Bounderby, and Flora Finching are all immediately identifiable as soon as they begin to talk. Orality figures prominently in other aspects of Dickens's personal and professional life. From his early talent for mimicry to his involvement in the theater, his experience as a shorthand reporter of parliamentary debates, and his tremendous popular success as a performer of public readings adapted from his novels. Dickens's voice as a storyteller has also been an important focus of recent research. Next slide, please. Taking up the challenge presented by deconstructive theory with its emphasis on écriture, Ivan Kreilkamp has explored the complex relationship between speech and writing in Dickens's career. Building on earlier work by Philip Collins, Malcolm Andrews, and Deborah Vlock, Kreilkamp locates a crucial ambivalence in Dickens's attitude toward orality. His wish, on the one hand, to mobilize the power of oral discourse and to identify it with his own work, and on the other, his distrust of loose talk, gossip, and empty rhetoric, and his efforts to expose those forms of irresponsible speech and submit them to the discipline of professional control. Voice and orality are unquestionably central features of Dickens's work, but they're not the whole of what Schaeffer would have us understand by the term soundscape. Soundscape for Schaeffer encompasses the totality of an acoustic environment and requires that listeners attend to the sonic background against which the more salient sounds that he calls signals stand out in stronger relief. Apprehending the soundscape of a Dickens novel requires a similar kind of reorientation, a shifting of attention not entirely away from voice, but onto the broader acoustic field in which voice is one of many elements. Several critics have followed Picker in attending to this broader band of acoustic data in Dickens's writing. Rosemary Bodenheimer has noted Dickens's ability to capture the sounds of the street. Chris Luteet has highlighted his interest in the sounds of work. The most probing investigation to date of Dickens's interest in sound appears in a series of essays by J. Clayton in an essay called The Dickens Tape. Clayton takes the 1844 Christmas story, The Chimes, as his point of entry into Dickens's rich acoustic world. Drawing on affect theory and distinguishing between sound recording and sound reproduction, Clayton argues forcefully for the ability of sound to produce effects on the listening body that exceed rational comprehension or even emotion, as that term is usually understood. For Clayton, the repetitive sound of bells, like those in the story of Toby Veck, has a collective or communal significance that he likens to the associations carried by folktale, legend, and literary conventions such as allegory. And I also should mention Jonathan Grossman's fine book on public transport and the novel, um, which, although sound is not the principal focus of Jonathan's study, uh, that book also has a number of interesting insights about the use that Dickens makes of sound, silence in Little Dorrit, and various kinds of sounds in The Old Curiosity Shop. Clayton's essay is one of the very few critical studies to examine soundscape in relation to a single Dickens text. In what follows, I propose to consider the role of sound in The Old Curiosity Shop, not in order to claim a single determinate meaning or function for its sonic effects, but as a way of demonstrating the range of Dickens's auditory imagination and analyzing a few of the specific operations. Babbage's theory of permanent sonic vibrations, while not the only conceptual model applicable to Curiosity Shop, will make a brief appearance again toward the end of my discussion. One way to begin consideration of the Dickensian soundscape is with a preliminary taxonomy. I discern 4 or perhaps 5 distinct categories of sound that appear in The Old Curiosity Shop, and presumably in other Dickens novels as well. First are natural sounds, by which I mean sounds produced by the non-human environment, by animals, by wind and moving water, by weather generally, or by any natural force independent of human agency. Next are mechanical sounds, those produced directly or indirectly as a result of human actions, for example, by tools or instruments, but without involving the human voice. A third category, the largest and most frequently recognized dimension of Dickensian sound effects, is that of voice in general and of human speech in particular. In addition to these rather obvious general categories, there's a fourth and particularly rich form of sound in Dickens, whose status is less certain and whose source frequently remains ambiguous or mysterious. These sounds, which we might call uncanny, are ones that derive from a source outside the merely natural or human sphere, or else result from the blurring of distinctions between the other categories. Examples of uncanny sound include the talking chair in the Bagman's story, one of the intercalated tales in the Pickwick Papers, or the waves that little Paul listens to so intently in Dombey and Son. Perhaps the most common form of uncanny sound in Dickens is the echo, with its simultaneous suggestion of ghostly return and ominous portent. A fifth and final category of Dickensian sound effect, different in kind from the others, but necessary to them as a backdrop and precondition is silence. Significantly for my purpose, the themes of sound and hearing appear early in The Old Curiosity Shop. In the third paragraph of the novel's opening chapter, immediately after introducing himself as a nocturnal wanderer of city streets, the narrator, Master Humphrey, offers the following oblique commentary on his speculative cast of mind. And the next slide, please. And this is a rather long quote, and it's at the very beginning of Old Curiosity Shop. That constant pacing to and fro, that never-ending restlessness, that incessant tread of feet, wearing the rough stones smooth and glossy. Is it a wonder how the dwellers in narrow ways can bear to think, to hear it? Think of a sick man in such a place as St. Martin's Court, listening to the footsteps, and in the midst of pain and weariness, obliged, despite himself, as though it were a task he must perform, to detect the child's step from the man's, the slipshod beggar from the hooded, the I'm sorry, I'm having trouble reading. Exquisite, the lounging from the busy, the thrill, the dull heel of the sauntering outcast from the quick tread of the expectant pleasure seeker. Think of the hum and noise being always present to his senses, and of the stream of life that will not stop, pounding on through his restless dreams, as if he were condemned to lie dead but conscious in a noisy churchyard and had no hope of rest for centuries to come. Who is this invalid of St. Martin's Court, condemned to listen as if from the grave to the endless footsteps of passers-by and to speculate on their identities? Why at this early stage does the story foreground hearing to such an extent and to the near exclusion of other sense impressions? And what is it that we as readers should be listening for as we make our way through this book? Several possible identifications for this figure come to mind. Presumably, the invalid is Master Humphrey himself, or rather, an imaginary alter ego who shares Humphrey's interest in children and whose effort to distinguish the child's step from the man's anticipates the encounter with Nell that will occur only a few paragraphs later. Or is the man of St. Martin's Court a preliminary sketch of Master Humphrey's housebound double, the single gentleman, who spends much of his time shut up in his room at Bevis Marks, and who, ever on the alert for a punch, also appears to rely to a great extent on his sense of hearing? Or might the invalid be an early version of that other displaced consciousness, the omniscient narrator, who takes over from Humphrey at the end of chapter 3, and who, like the invalid, apprehends a world in which he cannot participate? Indeed, can we think of the ability to overhear things without being seen as a version of novelistic omniscience? Literary scholars have often theorized omniscience as a form of visual power, using a model of sight that draws on the work of Michel Foucault and the infamous panopticon prison designed by Jeremy Bentham, in which a single centrally located guardian was able to keep watch over a multitude of prisoners. but omniscience could just as well be figured as a power of hearing. Curiosity Shop is full of scenes where one character listens to a conversation from an adjacent room and thereby gains knowledge or power over others. Finally, perhaps the invalid of St. Martin's Court could be a figure for the reader who, as he embarks on the task of making sense of a new text, must learn to listen as well as to see, to make meaningful distinctions out of the random noise of experience. In this respect, the hum and noise always present to his senses could be understood as an auditory version of the magic reel of fiction that unwinds in the novel's final chapter. What he and we are listening for, I suggest, are soundtracks, audible clues. And like most of the soundtracks in this novel, they lead eventually to Nell. Whoever this invalid may be, the paragraph clearly draws attention to hearing as a special mode of perception and to sound as a medium through which crucial intelligence can be obtained. Of the 5 types of sound effect that I have enumerated, neither natural sounds nor silence need detain us for very long. Despite the rural setting of much of the book, Curiosity Shop contains few scenes that attempt to imagine the natural world, whether visual or auditory. Dickens is not particularly interested in recording the sounds of nature, at least not in this book. The closest he comes to doing so is in the description of the storm that forces Nell and grandfather to take shelter in the inn called the Valiant Soldier. But even this storm merits only a brief paragraph and is quite conventional in its sound effects. It is perhaps a measure of Dickens's lack of interest in natural sound that, so far as I can tell, Nell's bird, although it survives until the end of the book, never warbles a note. Silence, on the other hand, receives more attention and carries greater thematic weight in Curiosity Shop than do the sounds of nature, though I shall touch only briefly on its significance. Silence is, for the most part, a quality that is prized and sought after in this book. But like its counterparts, peace of mind and physical rest, silence is in relatively short supply. For Nell, silence is associated with security and refuge. Although she enjoys Kit's laughter, on the whole, she prefers the quiet and seclusion of her life with grandfather. Her home in the shop is an island of tranquility in the midst of the great city, at least until those noisy intruders, Quilp and Brass, invade it. Nell herself is always softly spoken, unlike the many loud, verbally aggressive characters who surround and often persecute her with their talk. After she leaves home, her constant wish is to find a tranquil place of rest, away from Quilp's intrusive verbal intimacies, the harsh noise of the industrial town, or the songs of the bargemen, to mention only a few of the sounds that assault her. The paradox of silence in Curiosity Shop, of course, is that it resides most often in places associated with death. Graveyards, churches, and ecclesiastical buildings, outbuildings, such as the one where Nell and grandfather finally come to live. Nell's search for silence leads eventually to the deep, dark well inside the church, where distant echoes, the sexton tells her, make the heart leap into your mouth. It leads, that is, to the grave. More interesting and more varied than either natural sounds or silence are the passages in Curiosity Shop that evoke the sounds that I have called mechanical. One broad set of these derives from the world of popular culture, to which the novel devotes so much of its attention. Kit and Barbara's visit to Astley's, the theater, with their mothers. And little Jacob, for example, is a set piece of raucous cacophony. From the opening musical fanfare with strong parts for the drums and sweet effects for the triangles, to the gunfire which made Barbara wink, Astley's is full of noise. The reaction of the audience is equally loud and enthusiastic. And next slide, please. Little Jacob applauded till his hands were sore. Kit cried encore at the end of everything, the three act piece included. And Barbara's mother beat her umbrella on the floor in her ecstasies until it was nearly worn down to the gingham. Elsewhere in the novel, Dickens takes great care to indicate the musical instruments appropriate to each of the performing groups that Nell and Grandfather encounter on the road. Codlin and Short announced the arrival of their Punch and Judy show with a trumpet blast. And the next slide, please. When they came to any town or village, or even to a detached house of good appearance, Short blew a blast upon the brazen trumpet and called a fragment of sound, that hilarious tone common to punches and their consorts. If people turned to the windows, Mr. Codlin pitched the temple and hastily unfurling the drapery and concealing Short therewith, flourished hysterically on the pipes and performed an air. Grinders Stilt Walkers advertised their performance with a drum and tambourine. Jerry's Performing Dogs played a barrel organ as part of their act. One poor dog in disgrace for having lost a halfpenny earlier in the day is forced to go without his supper and does penance by grinding out the old 100th psalm mournfully as he watches his fellows consume their meal. Even the classical Mrs. Jarley promotes her stupendous collection with a drum and trumpet and decorates her caravan with well-used musical instruments, a triangle, a couple of well-thumbed tambourines, and the large drum on which she serves as her dinner table. The noisiest entertainers of all, however, are the punchmen, whose distinctive cries bring the mysterious single gentleman bolting from his room, and whose troop of admiring followers so disturb the tranquility of Bevis March with their hallooing and hooting that Sampson Brass resorts to bribing the drivers of hackney cabriolets to come suddenly round the corner and dash in among them precipitously in an effort to drive them away. Despite his apparent wish for peace and quiet on this occasion, Sampson Brass can be quite a noisy disturber of the peace when he has a mind. The scene where he beats on the single gentleman's door is another scene of cacophony. And there are other door knocking scenes in the book that emphasize the permeability of space and the many violated thresholds in the book. Another group of mechanical sounds in Curiosity Shop are the ones associated with urban and industrial settings. If Dickens seems to care relatively little in this book for the sounds of nature, his ear is ever alert to the oppressive noise and clatter of the city. When Nell and Grandfather enter the large manufacturing town in chapter 44, next slide, they are stunned by the roar of carts and wagons laden with clashing wares, the slipping of horses' feet upon the wet and greasy pavement, the rattling of rain on the windows and umbrella tops, the jostling of the more important passengers, and all the noise and tumult of a crowded street at the high tide of its occupation. Even more oppressive to their ears are the sounds of the factory through which they accompany the man by the fire. They follow him to, next slide, please, a large and lofty building supported by pillars of iron and with great black apertures in the upper walls, open to the external air, exhaling to the roof with the beating of hammers and roar of furnaces, mingled with the uh, hissing of red hot metal plunged in water, and 100 strange, unearthly noises never heard elsewhere. And notice that word unearthly, because I'll come back to that. Worst of all, however, are the Gothic shrieks and groans of the factory machines they pass on the outskirts of town as they depart. Next slide. Strange engines spun and writhed like tortured creatures, clanking their iron chains, shrieking in their rapid whirl from time to time as though in torment unendurable and making the ground tremble with their agonies. Writhing and moaning like lost souls in torment, the machines are transformed into sentient creatures, their sounds no longer merely mechanical, but ghostly or uncannily human. Their eerie moans, which anticipate the cries and shouts of the unemployed, whom Nell and grandfather see marching through the streets at night. Given the amount of oppressive noise with which Nell must contend, it is hardly surprising that she states her wish to escape so often in terms of the need for peace and quiet. A third group of mechanical sounds to which Dickens pays special attention in this novel of the road consists in the sounds of travel. For the most part, Nell and grandfather pursue their journey on foot, and Nell is increasingly exhausted as a result. As Hilary Shore has noted, Nell almost literally walks herself to death. Occasionally, the two travelers hitch a ride in a wagon or a barge. But even these brief respites are not always secure, as the barge experience amply demonstrates. In this scene, Nell is oppressed by noise and is even forced by the drunken bargemen to contribute to it herself, singing the same songs over and over again all through the night. Many a cottager, we read, was waked from his soundest sleep by the discordant chorus as it floated away upon the wind, hid his head beneath the bedclothes, and trembled at the sounds. Canals, of course, were an important feature of the industrial expansion of the Midlands. So the bargemen belonged to the modern industrial world that Dickens is exploring during this part of the book. Two instances of pleasant traveling stand out among the predominantly painful descriptions of Nell's journey. Both are distinguished by their attention to sound. Here, and next slide, please, is the comforting sound, at once domestic and nautical, of Mrs. Jarley's caravan getting underway. Away they went with a great noise of flapping and creaking and straining, with the bright brass knocker, which nobody ever knocked at, knocking one perpetual double knock of its own accord as they jolted heavily along. Like the invalid of the opening chapter, Nell here is confined to an interior, and like the invalid, she hears but does not see. The flapping, creaking, and straining resemble the sounds of a sailing ship getting underway, while the double knock suggests at once the postman's arrival. And at a deeper psychological level, the maternal heartbeat as experienced by an infant in utero. After all, Mrs. Jarley is as close as Nell ever comes in the novel to having a mother. Equally benign and even more distinctive is the extended description of Nell's drowsy journey in the wagon procured by the schoolmaster to carry her to the village where she will take up what proves to be her final residence. The passage is focalized entirely through the listening consciousness of Nell. And next slide. And this is a long quotation, but it's a wonderful passage and one of my favorite passages in the novel. What a soothing, luxurious, drowsy way of traveling, to be inside that slowly moving mountain, listening to the tinkling of the horses' bells, the occasional smacking of the carter's whip, the smooth rolling of the great broad wheels, the rattle of the harness, the dreary good nights of passing travelers jogging past on little short-stepped horses, all made pleasantly indistinct by the thick awning which seemed made for easy for listening under, and then fall asleep. The very going to sleep the very going to sleep with still with an indistinct idea as the head jogged to and fro upon the pillow of moving onward with no trouble or fatigue, and hearing all these sounds like dreamy music lulling to the senses. When was there a journey with so many delights as that journey in the wagon? It's just a lovely, lovely passage. For almost the first time since she and grandfather set out on their journey, Nell is comfortable and happy. But it is too late. The delicious womb-like drowsiness into which she sinks so readily is another measure of her fatigue and anticipates the final sleep that awaits her at her journey's end. Unlike the more joyous coaching scenes in Dickens's earlier novels, here the emphasis is on the passivity of the passenger. Nell's sleep is not the blessed regression to infancy of Pickwick, but the exhaustion of travel. Of all the sounds represented in The Old Curiosity Shop, by far the largest number belong to the category of voice. Dickens is, of course, preeminently the novelist of voice, and his ability to create memorable characters by giving them their own distinctive speech habits has long been recognized as one of the singular achievements of his art. According to George Henry Lewis, Dickens's friend, Dickens once claimed that every word said by his characters was distinctly heard by him. Like Sloppy and Our Mutual Friend, who do the police in different voices, or like the comic vocalist Little Swills in Bleak House, who recreates the legal inquest following Nemo's death by taking every part in turn. Dickens is a brilliant vocal impersonator. Like all of Dickens's novels, Curiosity Shop contains a rich variety of speaking parts. Among the minor characters endowed with distinctive speech patterns, we might notice the impudent clerk, Mr. Chuckster, with his affected urbanity and patronizing treatment of Kit, or Mrs. Jarley, whose conversations invariably modulate into the rhetoric of self-promotion, her exhibition tone, as the narrator calls it, whenever she has occasion to mention her stupendous collection. Another set piece of polyphonic virtuosity, typical in its theatricality and its use of free and direct discourse, is the report of Kit's trial in chapter 63, in which the narrative imitates judge, lawyers, and witnesses, each in turn. The entire scene is a reprise on a smaller scale of the Bardell versus Pickwick trial in the Pickwick Papers. Interestingly, Nell and most of the other good people in the book lack the verbal markers that would set their speech apart from that of other characters. Nell is said to possess a sweet and a pretty voice, like uh, one that reminds grandfather of Nell's mother, and that causes the man by the fire to say, "Speak again, do I know thy voice?" As if he recognized something familiar in it from his past. But sweetness, like beautiful landscape, does not lend itself readily to individuation. We know that Nell works uh, as a guide at Mrs. Jarley's waxworks, and she later accompanies groups of people on tours of the village church and graveyard. But in neither instance do we hear her voice. In fact, it is remarkable how seldom she speaks at all. Few readers, I suspect, can remember more than one or two significant things that she says. She has no line comparable to Oliver's famous, "Please, sir, I want some more." Instead, it is the book's comic and grotesque characters whose voices stand out most distinctly. Samson Brass, with his oily obsequiousness, Quilp, whose voice register ranges from animal croaks to a sarcastic, often sadistic wit. And finally, of course, Dick Swiveller, that great human jukebox, as John Bowen calls him, whose character is a brilliant composite of theatrical cliches and snatches of popular song, spliced together as if by some slightly crazed disc jockey into a virtuoso performance that has won him the admiration of critics and ordinary readers alike. Rather than attempt to catalog the different kinds of speech or dialects, the idiolects that the novel contains, I want instead to direct attention to another less obvious feature of the way in which voice is represented in the Old Curiosity Shop: its frequent dissociation or displacement from the body. The most common examples of the separation of voice from body take place in what we might think of as a version of the familiar theatrical entrance in which a character speaks before coming on stage. The equivalent in narrative fiction of such entrances occurs when a character speaks before the narrator has mentioned that he or she is present in a scene. Dickens uses this technique frequently for surprise effect, to introduce a character suddenly or to indicate that someone has been present without our knowing it, either because that person has been hiding or is, for some other reason, insignificant or easy to overlook. In Curiosity Shop, the chief practitioner of the surprise entrance is Quilp, who is always sneaking up on people and listening in on their conversations, and who sneaks up on the reader in a similar fashion. Examples of the second kind, the insignificant or unnoticed character, includes Nell, the Marchioness, and the young Abel Garland, all of whom make their initial appearance in the book as a disembodied voice. The dissociation of voice and body also occurs in other, less predictable contexts in the book. Next slide. Here, for example, is an early description of Kit in chapter 1. The lad had a remarkable manner of standing sideways as he spoke, and thrusting his head forward over his shoulder as if he could get at his voice, as if he could not get at his voice without that accompanying motion. Voice here is figured as something outside the body rather than as a sound produced from within. Kit must make a physical effort to get at his voice, lest it elude him altogether. Even Dick Swiveller, the character in whom voice and person seem most happily united, is momentarily troubled by the possibility that he may have lost them both. Next slide. When he recovers from his illness, his first words to the Marchioness are, "Marchioness, Be pleased to draw nearer. First of all, will you have the gentleness? Will you have the goodness to inform me of where I shall find my voice? And secondly, what has become of my flesh? Illness puts Dick's subjectivity at risk and renders his identity dispersed. To lose one's voice becomes for him more than an empty metaphor. A third example of vocal displacement and a wonderful example of Dickensian mixed metaphor is the following description of Samson Brass. Could we have the next slide? And I should say that this is my favorite passage in the entire Old Curiosity Shop. And I think it's also one of the funniest. It was a maxim with Mr. Brass that the habit of paying compliments kept a man's tongue oiled without any expense. And as that useful member might never grow rusty or creak in turning on its hinges in the case of a practitioner of the law, in whom it should be always glib and easy. He lost few opportunities of improving himself by the utterance of handsome speeches and eulogistic expressions. And that had passed into such a habit with him that if it could not be correctly said to have his tongue at his fingers' ends, he might certainly be said to have it anywhere but in his face. And I think this sentence, these two sentences are just hilariously funny. They're a mixed metaphor. The rhetorical term for that is catachresis, where you take two metaphors or two idioms or two figurative passages and yoke them together in a way that, in this case, produces this wonderful, grotesque, anatomical idea of a tongue at one's fingertips. In this case, it's not the voice directly that is displaced, but the organ of speech, the tongue. The grotesque anatomical metaphor that Dickens briefly conjures here of a tongue at Samson Brass's fingertips might serve more generally as a figure for the displacement of speech into writing, a metaphor as apt for the modern writer at her computer as it is for the 19th century author with his quill. The chief instance of vocal displacement in the book, one that the other examples I have cited all gesture toward in one way or another, is the displacement that occurs in the novel's narrative structure. After narrating the first 3 chapters of the story, Master Humphrey steps aside and yields his position to an impersonal voice that carries the story forward to the end. But does Master Humphrey really disappear? Or has he just gone into hiding and allowed his voice, like Samson Brass's tongue, to keep working, but from a different location, while he continues to overhear those who have prominent and necessary parts in the story? Audrey Jaffe argues that Curiosity Shop repeatedly focuses on observational activity, shifting from an unframed central action to an observer on the periphery of that action, who is in turn displaced by another observer, and so on. The novel as a whole, she suggests, is structured around a series of similar visual displacements that move between subject and object and that are central to the nature of curiosity. The nature of Dickensian omniscience, she insists, is that the omniscient narrator can never quite manage to be entirely inside or outside or entirely outside of the narrative. My own argument is similar, though I would place greater emphasis on the displacement of voice and on the various narrator surrogates who appear in the text after Master Humphrey takes his leave, especially the ones who, through their age, infirmity, melancholy outlook, or solicitous concern for Nell. Recall Master Humphrey himself. These avatars of Humphrey include the man by the fire, the schoolmaster, the bachelor, the clergyman, the sexton, and of course the single gentleman, whom we discover from Master Humphrey's confession in the clock, material that immediately follows the novel, and against all probability, to have been Master Humphrey himself in his role as grandfather's younger brother. So the argument here that I'm suggesting is that Master Humphrey is the narrator of the entire novel, and that this is an example of ventriloquism, that is, of speaking from a place where one is not. The topic of the displaced, disembodied, or dematerialized voice brings me to the final category of sound that I want to take up with respect to the Old Curiosity Shop, the sounds I have called uncanny. I've already mentioned a couple of examples of this type. The machines in chapter 45, whose ghostly shrieks and moans stand in for the suffering of factory workers and the unemployed. A more complete account of uncanny sounds in the book would take us back to Master Humphrey's clock, to Master Humphrey himself, and to the old house in which he lives. According to Humphrey, and the next slide, please, his house is a repository of memories that take the form of ghostly sounds. And this comes not from the novel, but from the clock material that precedes the clock. But of course, since Master Humphrey is the bridge between the earlier material, the clock material as it's called, and the novel, there's a close connection. So this is the Master Humphrey's description of his house, the house where he lives. It is a silent, shady place where a paved courtyard so full of echoes that sometimes I am tempted to believe that faint responses to the noises of old times linger there yet, and that these ghosts of sound haunt my footsteps as I pace it up and down. I am the more confirmed in this belief because of late years, the echoes that attend my walks have been less loud and marked than they were wont to be. And it is pleasanter to imagine in them the rustling of silk brocade and the light step of some lovely girl than to recognize in their altered note the failing tread of an old man. Recluse, fantasist, audiophile, and connoisseur of female footsteps, the Master Humphrey of this passage closely resembles the invalid of St. Martin's Court in the novel's opening chapter. Master Humphrey's mansion, in effect, functions as a kind of preternatural sound storage facility. Its courtyard and empty rooms are a warehouse where sounds from the past still linger, awaiting activation by the presence of an attentive listener, whose motion triggers the ghostly playback mechanism. Here, on a less cosmic scale, we can recognize Babbage's theory of acoustic permanence, of sounds that do not disappear but remain like ghosts awaiting retrieval. The next slide, please. With its exterior courtyard and its intricate interior architecture of low ceilings crossed by clumsy beams, its walls of wainscot, dark stairs, and gaping closets, its small chambers communicating with each other by winding passages or narrow steps, its many nooks, scarce larger than its corner cupboards. The house replicates the structure of human hearing. Is it too much to suggest that Master Humphrey lives inside a giant artificial ear? Another important source of uncanny sound effects is the famous clock that lends its name to Master Humphrey's Reading Society, the group of elderly gentlemen who gather bi-weekly to read aloud manuscripts extracted from the clock case. Part human and part machine, the clock is a kind of 19th century android. It serves as a cheerful companion, offering comfort and consolation for the sorrows of Master Humphrey's life. The clock is introduced immediately after Humphrey recounts the story of his childhood, how his mother died when he was young, and how he first came to the early realization after seeing the look of sorrow on her face that he was a poor crippled boy. Although he remains attached to many inanimate objects associated with his past, the clock occupies a special place among them, largely because the regular throb of its pendulum makes it easy to endow with human qualities. In Humphrey's fantasy, the clock seems to take the place of the absent mother and helps compensate for the pain of her loss. I listened to it as if it were alive and could understand and give me back the love I bear it. That's a quote by Master Humphrey. Along with its regular heartbeat, the clock also has a distinctive voice. Humphrey finds solace in its cricket voice and reassurance in the sound of its bell in the dread of night. The clock speaks to him with the intimacy of a loved one or a parent. The next slide. How often he writes, in the summer twilight, when my thoughts have wandered back to a melancholy past, have its regular whisperings recalled them to the calm and peaceful present. The clock's audible presence sets it apart from other material objects and reinforces the fantasy that it is a living being, the source and repository of stories that bring comfort to the melancholy man. I want to conclude this survey of acoustic effects in the Old Curiosity Shop by considering what is, for me, the strangest, most uncanny sound that the novel represents, the sound that registers the death of little Nell. Readers will remember that after Nell and grandfather's whereabouts have been determined, a rescue party composed of Kit, Mr. Garland, and the single gentleman sets out to find and bring her back to London. As they approach the ruined parsonage to which they have been directed, Kit spies a lighted window and goes on ahead toward it. He tries to see inside, but a curtain has been drawn. Visual access to the scene, both for Kit and for the reader, is denied. He listens, but is greeted only by silence. Again and again, the same wearisome blank. Leaving the window, he comes at length to a door, and this is the passage. So, next slide. He knocked, no answer, but there was a curious noise inside. It was difficult to determine what it was. It bore a resemblance to the low moaning of one in pain, but it was not that, being far too regular and constant. Now it seemed a kind of song, now a wail, seemed, that is, to his changing fancy, for the sound itself was never changed or checked. It was unlike anything he had ever heard, and in its tone there was something fearful, chilling, and unearthly. That word that I pointed out before. Fearful of what this curious and unearthly sound may portend, Kit lifts the latch and prepares to enter, but the weekly installment ends before he or we are allowed to know. The dreadful sound is, of course, grandfather, but to identify him as its sole source is to foreclose prematurely an ambiguity that the narrative takes care to leave open. The horror of this sound lies both in the mystery of its origin and in the uncertainty as to its very nature, whether it is even human, a kind of primal keening prior to or in excess of any human speech. The sound records a grief that is beyond words, not discourse, but abject vocal misery, and once again, disembodied, displaced. Notice that grandfather does not make this sound because he thinks that Nell is dead. On the contrary, when Kit enters, the demented old man believes that Nell is only sleeping, and even that he hears her voice calling to him. The sound seems to pass through grandfather from without, as if he as if its source were elsewhere and he only its medium of transmission. In this sense, we can say that the sound is overdetermined, its origin multiple rather than limited to any one source. It has no single author. Rather, it registers in advance the general grief that will overtake the entire community when the certainty of Nell's death becomes known, including the community of readers in Master Humphrey's circle, as well as contemporary Victorian readers like Lord Jeffrey and Macready, whose actual tears have been recorded, to say nothing of the crowd of Americans, as legend has it, supposedly waiting for news of Nell on the docks in New York Harbor. It registers as well a grief that has been slowly accumulating through the narrative in connection with the deaths too numerous to mention that have been reported along the way. From the schoolmaster's little pupil to the three children of the man in Birmingham where Nell begs for bread, to Master Humphrey's mother, or if we look outside the book, Mary Hogarth, presumably the encrypted death of the in this apparently endless chain of signifiers. And while we're at it, why not mention the literary genealogy that includes Richardson's Clarissa and King Lear's Cordelia, among others? It also registers our own grief as readers, unless we join with Oscar Wilde in warding off that grief with laughter. If the old curiosity shop can be said to have what Schaeffer calls a keynote, a fundamental tone around which the composition as a whole is organized, and to which others sounds stand in relationship, I propose that this is it. The unearthly, disembodied sound that Kit hears at the end of chapter 70 resonates back through the novel to its earlier moments, to the invalid of St. Martin's Court who imagines himself condemned to lie dead but conscious in a noisy graveyard, and to Master Humphrey at his clockside, still grieving for the loss of his young mother and for himself, and living in an old mansion haunted by ghosts of sound. It is a melancholy sound, but Curiosity Shop is an overwhelmingly melancholy book, at least in the reading that I give to it. And this despite the partially mitigating presence of Swiveller and the Marchioness. Finally, no discussion of sound and soundscape in the Old Curiosity Shop can be complete without at least some mention of its bells and of the ominous motif implicit in the name Nell, as Jonathan Grossman pointed out, without Nell, without the silent K that echoes subliminally through the entire book. J. Clayton rightly emphasizes the affective dimension of Dickens's bells, their ability to convey meanings that elude rational comprehension. The bells of Curiosity Shop function similarly as premonitions of Nell's inevitable end. As he approaches the tomb where Nell's body will lie, the narrator hears the bell that she heard so often by night and day, and listened to with a solemn pleasure, almost as a living voice. The narrator hears what Nell hears, a double hearing, each with a different inflection. The bell that Nell hears as a living voice reveals itself to the narrator and to the reader as a summons to the grave. The final sentence of chapter The Last, and next uh, slide, please, picks up the motif of bells with another subliminal pun. And this, again, is something that Jonathan Grossman points out. Such are the changes that a few years bring about, and so do things pass away, like a tale that is told. The moral of the book is told, Tolled, as well as told, Told. It is thus little wonder that no sooner does he replace the manuscript that he has been reading in the case of his beloved clock, that Master Humphrey hears the bells of St. Paul's and recounts the story of his visit to the cathedral clock, the heart of London, which throbs in its giant breast, imagining that when it should cease to beat, the city would be no more. The Old Curiosity Shop is a noisy book, one of the noisiest of Dickens's novels, but it is by no means the only one in which sound has an important role to play. Think, for example, of the echoing footsteps outside Lucy Manette's home in A Tale of Two Cities, or the drip, drip, drip that echoes on the ghost walk at Chesney Wold in Bleak House whenever disaster or disgrace threatens the Dedlock family. Think, too, of the scene at the piano between Jasper and Rosa Budd in The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Indeed, the topic of music in Dickens is one that deserves further study and that this essay has barely touched upon. Think also of that early sound studies investigator, Stony Durdles, in the same novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, tapping with his hammer on the walls of the crypt in Cloisterham Cathedral to locate the corpses of his oldens. Dickens even makes Durdles briefly a comic proponent of Babbage's theory of sonic permanence, as the following exchange with Jasper indicates. Next slide. Durdles asks, but do you think there may be ghosts of other things, though not of men and women? And Jasper says, what things? Flower beds and watering pots? Horses and harnesses? And Durdle says, no, sounds. Jasper says, what sounds? And Durdles replies, cries. Durdles goes on to explain that a year ago on Christmas Eve, he was suddenly awakened by screeches that turn out not to have been heard by any other living ears. He concludes in language that recalls Master Humphrey's account of living in a mansion haunted by ghosts of sound, that what he heard was the ghost of a cry, another example of what I have called uncanny sound. As Durdles and these other examples suggest, sound studies offers a potentially fruitful avenue of approach to Dickens's fiction and to the soundscapes it contains. Critics have long recognized that Dickens possessed a powerful visual imagination. It is time to acknowledge that he possessed an equally acute auditory imagination, and that we should stay attuned to his novels even as we read them silently to ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. That was fantastic and well worth waiting for. And we already have our first question, so I'm going to allow people to unmute themselves. Um, and Kirk, go ahead.
Well, John, and you've ordered me to call you John and not your title.
Hey,
John, that was a really great presentation. Uh, Question. Some people have said that Dickens novels are like very massive, long screenplays. And as you know, in screenplays, sound effects are very seldom emphasized. They're only really mentioned in a screenplay when it's crucial to the narrative. If we look at the example from chapter 17, which begins when they came to any town or village, etc., the phrase that's actually in the book is flourished hysterically on the pipes and performed an air. It could just as well have been, perhaps, flourished hysterically on the flute and performed a ditty. So my question is, in your mind, is Dickens going for the sound of the words as they're spoken aloud, or is he more trying to create a sonic impression in your mind?
Well, interesting question. And I'm not sure I have a clear answer. What do you think, Kirk? I mean, I'll bounce the question back in your direction.
My feeling after reading all of his visual descriptions is that he's actually trying to create the sound of the pipes in your mind. That although the text is very, very beautiful when read aloud, his real goal, I think his intention, whatever he achieved, but his intention was to actually create the same kind of visual landscape in your mind he does with his words about sound. So I think although the words are very beautiful when read aloud, I think he was intending, like a screenplay writer would, to impress in your mind the actual sound of the pipes.
Um, One of the things that I tried to tease out at other places in the passages that I read is the what I call subliminal punning that is going on, particularly with um, the name Nell and the pun on Nell as the sound of a bell. And one of the ideas that sort of lingers in the back of my mind about Curiosity Shop as a novel is that Dickens is recalling for the entire novel one of the lines of poetry from a poem that he particularly admired, which is the elegy written in a country churchyard. And um, the opening line is the curfew tolls the knell of parting day. And you have tolls there and knell in the same line with the word parting that also has significance for Dickens. So there are ways in the novel where I think he's trying to recall or imitate the sound that he describes. So it's very possible that in the passage that you are talking about, that he's doing something similar. So thanks for the suggestion. And of course, the other thing to say is that uh, uh, people have often commented on the cinematic quality of Dickens's novels, and in doing so, they emphasize the visual rather than the auditory. But I think both go together, and soundtracks. You know, I punned on that word in my paper as well, that this is a novel in which the reader is invited to look for soundtracks, and that the soundtracks always lead to the knell, which is the death of that character.
Well, this was simply a brilliant talk, John. Thank you so much. There's so much to think about. We'll be studying this for months to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Glenna, go ahead. Glenna, are you having trouble unmuting?
Thanks. Oh, this was wonderful, John. And I love the concept of auditory imagination. It spoke to me so much because I've recounted many times that I came to know Dickens through reading Pickwick Papers out loud with my parents. And I fell in love with Pickwick Papers because of Jingle. I love the speech of Jingle. And so the soundscape is also a concept and auditory imagination that explains why Dickens is so magical to read out loud, because so many characters have these remarkable speech patterns that, well, I mean, I think Martin Chuzzlewit isn't a perfect novel, but it's got Mrs. Gamp in it, you know? And so this concept in this talk just shed all kinds of new light, maybe, on why I love Dickens so much. So thank you.
Well, just to comment, thank you for enjoying the talk and reminding us of Pickwick Papers. But lots of people talk about the voices in Dickens and the voices of characters like Jingle and Mrs. Gamp. But what I am trying especially to do is to add to that the other sounds in his novels, and that when it's not just that we should listen to Miriam Margolyes read the novels aloud and enjoy her wonderful vocal rendition of those novels, but that we should listen imaginatively to the sounds that are the entire soundscape of his novels.
Right. But what I'm trying to suggest is that the reason he gave us all these wonderful voices is because he had the acute auditory imagination. And
Exactly.
that's the context for why these novels have this kind of character. So anyhow, thank you, and I'll mute myself.
Thanks, Glenna.
Kirk, I see that your hand is up, but can I ask a question before we go back to you? Smile and nod if that's okay. Okay, thanks. John, I wanted to ask you a question about the relationship between sound and agency. Um, because in that first quote, and we don't have to go back to the slides, but the first quote, when Master Humphrey is talking about sounds, and it ends with somebody in a grave, dead but conscious, kind of having no choice but to constantly hear these sounds, like they feel like something that comes in whether or not you want them to. Like you have no choice but to sort of absorb these sounds. And then in the sort of one of the quotes towards the end, the one about the unearthly noise. It says, now it seemed a kind of song, now a wail, seemed that is to his changing fancy, for the sound itself was never changed or checked. So in that case, like the sound is still coming to him, but it's all about like what the sound actually is kind of based on his own sort of changing fancy, his own changing sense of things. So I just wondered if you could, I don't know, like talk a little bit about how sound kind of messes with agency or makes us think differently about agency. Like sound is something that you just have no choice but to hear, or sound as something that you can actively change in some way, or that changes based on what it is that you are doing or thinking or feeling.
Well, in the first chapter, the third paragraph of the novel, that figure is an active listener. He's condemned to lie in the grave, but he spends his time trying to distinguish the kinds of people who are walking in the world outside the grave. So listening there is a very intense, motivated, and activity full of agency on the part of the listener. And um, in my reading, I'm suggesting that that's a figure for the reader, that the reader is being told in this instance, listen carefully to this book, uh, uh, because you too must participate in that activity of interpretation and discrimination. But in the final passage, Kit, the passage of that comes from grandfather, but that I argue really comes from everywhere in the book. Uh, the sound, although Kit is looking for Nell, and he tries first to see through the window, and he can't see. So what encounters him, what comes without his expecting it, or uh, is this agentless sound, this sound which is unearthly and uh, curious, uh, which echoes the title of the novel as well. Um, so yes, both kinds of sound I think are present in um, in the novel. And in that wonderful passage of Nell in the wagon, not the one, not Mrs. Jarley's wagon, but the schoolmaster's wagon. Uh, she's drowsy, passive, not actively trying to discern the sounds outside, but being lulled to sleep in what I think is a wonderful way. But with the sound around her coming in without uh, any agency on her part or agency really of the world outside her.
Thank you. Melissa, I see your hand up, but Bob Patten, I think that you had a manual hand up. Did you?
Kirk, remember?
Kirk did. Courtney, I thought that you had mentioned that Bob Patten also had a question.
I thought he might have, but I guess not.
Okay. Kirk, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, this is a silly one, but Professor, I can't help but asking about the Oscar Wilde quote. I've always wondered if that wasn't sort of like envious, little aside, a little envious jibe, because this book has so much beautiful prose in it. Uh, do you think Oscar Wilde did not appreciate the greatness of Old Curiosity Shop? Was he just making a clever thing to get a laugh at a party, or what was that all about?
Well, I think he was moved by the sentimentality and didn't want to admit it. And the way he dealt with that confused condition, um, that emotion, was to make a joke about it. And um, so it's not so much envy as a sort of self-protective gesture. I think it's a way of acknowledging that this is a very powerful novel and that it it evokes an emotional response. Um, and he was, I guess you could say, he was trying to engage in a one-upsmanship with the novel by making this quip that will all forever stand alongside the novel as a response and guide some readers uh, to to resist the very powerful sentiment that lies at its heart.
Melissa, go ahead.
Thank you. It is so wonderful to see you, John. Thank you very much for that. I am just thinking about sound leaving impressions on molecules and um I'm just kind of thinking back to I'm in the UK right now and being at the Dickens house and places like that, and I'm just wondering about sort of the literary tourism industry and I'm just wondering what you think about going to these places. I really wonder if part of our fascination with going to places where Dickens was is also connected to that sort of way of conceptualizing sound. Like when you go to Rochester and you go out to the marshes and you hear the wind through that landscape, that you're hearing something similar in a place to what he heard. And I've just never really thought about the sound aspect of it.
No, I think that's a lovely connection. And yes, what is it that motivates us to visit those places? We want in some way to experience something similar to what the author or the individual whom we're curious about and whom we want to get back in touch with and feel. And this again is a pun I was trying to use at the very end, that we're attuned with, that we're when we visit Dickens House Museum or the for me because I had been to the museum before and think of it as a museum, I'm able to experience it as a museum rather than as a place in which Dickens is present as some kind of ghost. But when I went to Italy and went to the Villa Piaschieri, if I'm remembering the name of the place where Dickens lived during his time in Italy, I felt a presence because it's not a museum. It's open to visitors on request. And I felt I was entering a private place where Dickens was present, both um, in my memory and perhaps in the pulsations of the air that includes sound. So I think invoking uh, the idea of literary tourism is very appropriate in this context. So thanks for that idea.
Thanks.
I'm going to read a question from Dan Stout that's in the chat. He says that his house is a soundscape of screaming children, so he can't unmute. Um, but he says, John, I'm interested in your suggestion that overheard sound might be how Dickens thinks about omniscient narration. One difference it would make to go via sound rather than sight is the ambiance and indirection and possibly like the compiled syntheticness of what's being brought together. And he says he doesn't know if that question makes sense, but if you have thoughts about this, thoughts in these directions. So just sort of like what sort of I think Dan, what you're getting at is the idea that, when you're kind of looking at everything, you're kind of like looking in a certain direction, but sound kind of comes from everywhere and everything and comes in all these different ways and comes from so many different things and that there's something different there in the way of thinking about what omniscience looks like when there is that kind of like multi-directionality, that kind of just like things are in the airness about it.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I had thought about the difference between um, the the Foucault model of visual the panopticon and the directionality of that observation and the um, more ambient form of sound. Um, but there's also in Curiosity Shop uh, the the trope of overhearing, of listening, that is more directional and that is more purposeful. Um, and then there's at least one discussion. I think it's Philip Davis who talks about the present tense narration in Bleak House as being like the Babbage theory of sound, that the narrator in the third person narrator in Bleak House is like that Babbage all listening um, consciousness. But there is a difference, and I take the point that you're making. So, good question. Thanks, Dan.
There were While we're waiting just to see if anyone has a list. Oh, okay, never mind. Sharon, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, great. So, first of all, I really enjoyed this enormously. It was very moving. And in fact, I'm now finding myself thinking of you as our preeminent scholar of the uncanny voice, of the uncanny sound that really does remind us how sad this novel is. And what I find myself wanting to ask about, though, is the character that you reminded us is also the comic character, the character that brings joy and fun to the novel, in which Little Nell dies. And that, of course, is Dick Swiveller. And that brings me to the question of voicing song. Now, you mentioned that music is one of the elements that you're not going to be concentrating as much, although you did bring some in. And I want to ask if how thinking about the human voice in song would change or would affect, or how it fits in. And once you fit something in, everything changes a little bit. Um, the many, many songs that Dick Swiveller sings. And I'm thinking in particular that Jeff Spear actually put together the Dick Swiveller songbook. And he distributed it to his own seminar group. Um, and I have a copy of it. It's 30 pages long. That's how many songs there are. And you know what they what happens when you have a song embedded in the text is that the readers, the contemporary readers knew those songs. So they're hearing those songs while they're reading those words. So the words are important and the tunes are important, and the conjunction of them and the connection it makes between author, character, and audience are important in the meaning of the whole. So given that dynamic is taking place at the time of Old Curiosity Shop's publication and all the readership thereafter that knew those songs, how does that affect what you're thinking about?
Very true that the contemporary audience in 1840 would have recognized those references in a way that we need footnotes for, or need Jeff Spear's songbook for. And I'll ask Jeff for a copy. I knew he was interested in that and in Swiveler's songs, and I invited him to perform any two of them at last summer's conference, but he respectfully declined. But yes, contemporary readers would have recognized those songs and would probably have memories of their own of having heard them on particular occasions. And so the associations would have been individual and probably different across a range of readers who had that imaginative experience. But that's, I think, is one of the wonderful things about the references to music, is that in all fiction, not just in Curiosity Shop, that we have our own personal associations with a particular performance of a song or of any piece of music, and we bring that to our understanding of the passage, and it's a form of reader response that needs to be included in the if we I can't think of an example right off the top of my head, but if in a work of fiction we have a reference not just to a song but to a particular performance by a singer or a pianist or another musician, then we could perhaps localize more specifically the response. But without that kind of local reference, we're free to imagine it ourselves. The other context is, of course, the what is it? The Glorious Harmonics. What's the name of the singing group that Dick Swiveller belongs to? Those groups of which, was Dickens ever a member of a choral group or a song group? Do we know? He was a singer. He had a voice, but alas, we have no recordings of Dickens as a singer.
Thank you. And can I point out one more thing?
Please.
Well, it isn't just memory of a performance that you go to as a reader. It's a memory of your own singing of these songs, because these are not uncommon songs.
Yes.
So you could have had repeated experiences of the song, including through your own voice.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you.
There were a couple of questions in the chat or mentions in the chat of deafness and questions of deafness. Martha, you were one of the people who mentioned that you were interested in deafness. I wondered if you wanted um, to to ask about that or to unfold a little bit what you were saying.
Oh, thanks so much, Renee. So, I will just say really, really briefly, Dr. Marigold is probably the most sustained look at deafness, but deafness shows up everywhere in Dickens. But I just think that John's brilliant and just generative talk, so wonderful, made me also think about so many other things that are connected with sound, the absence of sound, sign, communicating through sign. Uh, Dickens is interested in all these things, as you know, so all know so much better than I do. But so it seemed like this is a great place. I was thinking, oh, I'm going to have to go think about things I've already thought and written about with as a palimpsest with that past experience and then John's lecture overlaid on me as I go and reread and rethink. And so it's just like basically gratitude for that. So, and there's some other lovely comments that folks had made in here about yeah, Dickens, other things, Liz Pollock's comment about ear trumpets and sort of that whole larger landscape. So essentially your talk, like all wonderful talks, just opens us all out into additional explorations and generative thinking. So again, thank you.
Thank you, Martha. And yes, of course, deafness is something that many people have noticed and as a concern of Dickens, um, and there is a deaf man in Master Humphrey's reading group. So.
We have time for probably one more question. I had kind of decided in my mind that 2:45 was going to be the ending time sort of arbitrarily. So if anybody has one more question, we would be very happy to have it. Glenna, go ahead.
This is just thinking about the very interesting question by Sharon about the contemporary versus the modern. And this isn't music, but I was thinking, I think there's a passage in Villette where the heroine, Lucy Snow, goes to the performance in Paris by the great actress Rachel. And of course, she would have been declaiming in French, and that whole passage would have had a completely different meaning for people who were reading Villette than it does now. And I was also thinking of a novel by Thomas Hardy that in which village choristers figure substantially. So I'm just throwing that in because this has been I have a month's worth of thinking to do about not only the talk but the questions. So thank you.
Yeah, I think there hasn't been enough work done on, from a sound studies perspective, on the novels of the 19th century. John Picker's book that I mentioned is the best that has been done, but there really are very few that focus in a continuous way on soundscape in the novels. So I was how did I get interested in this topic? Because I had never thought much about sound in novels before, other than voice. And it's because I read that passage about Nell traveling in the wagon and how delicious it was to travel in the wagon. And I have memories of having been in wagons and the sounds of a horse-drawn carriage. And I thought, wow, it's beautiful prose, and it's also a way of rendering sensation in print that I found very moving. So anyway, thank you all. Thank you for that observation, Glenna, and thank you everyone for taking time on a Sunday to listen.
Let's offer John a huge thank you for this wonderful talk. Thank you all for being here and have wonderful holidays. And it's been so lovely to get to see all of you and think about you and it's a perfect way to end the term, I think. So have a lovely rest of your Sunday, and we will hopefully see you all sooner rather than later.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.